Okay, so my talk is entitled Hunger and Hallucinations, Tales from the Great Famine. It's a little bit long, I have to warn you, but hopefully it'll be interesting. Okay. In 1860 or thereabouts, Musa Sirso climbed a hill in Ashrafiye, the necropolis of the ancient Roman city of Beirut, and pointed to the ground where he wished his palace to be built. It would be a testament to his family's wealth, fitting proof of their climb to the highest echelons of power. But before the palace could be constructed, the builders had to first contend with the bones and leavings of the dead. Excavating a foundation for the great house revealed grave upon grave, tomb upon tomb. It is not known what they did with all the skeletal remains, although it is not difficult to guess. What is known, however, was that some of the glass from the unguntaria found in the tombs ended up in the stained glass windows of the magnificent palace, and one of the sarcophagi was hauled off to the stables and used as a feeding trough for the horses. In late October 1914, the Ottoman Empire joined World War I, and the first bread riots broke out in Beirut 2 weeks later. It's a familiar image of any disaster. The emergency befalls, and everyone rushes off to the bakeries, clamoring for bread. The bread we use here is both food and utensil, a way of extending whatever amount of food we have, as well as an expression of our willingness to eat from the same plate, to share that food. The people rioting in the streets that November day probably had no inkling that this was the beginning of one of the great disasters of the Great War, which would have many more disasters to its name by the time it had redrawn the map of the world. Sometime later, British and French naval ships churned into place off the coastline of the entire Levant, cutting off supply lines and preventing the transport of any and all goods in and out. I say any and all goods, but what they were primarily there to blockade was the import of food. Wheat. No wheat meant no bread. No bread meant slow starvation, and eventually the breakdown of the entire community who once shared their food so willingly with one another. People began hiding their food, not just to store it away for later use, but to hide it from others so that neighbors wouldn't come knocking, asking for what people could no longer afford to give. From the memoirs of Salwa Mdawar, a Beiruti, quote, I remember during the war my grandmother ordered us indoors and shut all the blinds when she was sorting lentils. Where once she sat out in the sun, placing her large copper tray on a low wooden table, she now placed it on the ground in the living room, bending over it with her candle. She didn't want the neighbors to know that we had lentils to sort. Sometimes she even asked my brother to rattle a tin can, which frightened the dog and set him to barking outside. This was when the hunger got so bad she was afraid that someone might hear the sound of the dry grains sliding over the copper tray and break into our house and steal our stores. I remember her bent over the pile of lentils, her candle in one hand while she sorted with the other. But her eyesight was bad, and sometimes we ended up with rocks in our lentils, and sometimes even bits of candle wax. When my brother complained, having chipped his tooth on a rock, my mother told him that at least he got to eat lentils along with rocks, that some people in the city were living on rocks alone. From the Sirso house high up on the hill, you would have probably been able to see the ships on clear days and see the immobilized port, no longer a symbol of progress, but an emblem of its collapse. By 1915, Jamal Basha, the governor of Greater Syria, and the head of the Navy by the beginning of the war, had requisitioned the grain arriving to Mount Lebanon and the coastal cities by inland routes for military use. The bread lines grew, the bread riots multiplied. Wheat merchants took to mixing their wheat with different materials, other plants, herbs, sometimes even straw and dirt to extend supplies. At times, bread purchased from local bakeries would turn moldy within a day. White bread was black on the second day and gray or purple by the following evening. Bshar al-Barudi, a Beiruti merchant, writes, quote, "I still remember the coming of Jamal Basha as he passed in front of the pharmacy in a red car and the day was rainy and the road muddy. He had a thick beard and fiery eyes and wore a black kalpak, and the women threw black bread at him to show him what the people were eating. He became angry and had the women arrested and ordered to have them flogged," unquote. Did they speak of these happenings over the lavish dinners held at the Sirsot house where Jamal Basha was rumored to bring his mistress? Or did they have other things to discuss? Michel Sirsot, after all, descendant of Musa, had been dispatched by Jamal Basha to requisition grain from Hauran. The peasants were under instructions to sell all the grain to him for a low price, and they were allowed to keep only enough for their own families. Michel Sirsot also controlled the concession for wheat in the area. Working with other wealthy, well-known families, he manipulated supplies by closing granaries and engaged in price speculation, driving the price up from 40 piastres a measure of grain to 250 piastres. Bertolt Brecht once wrote that famines do not occur, they are organized by the grain trade. A rhyme began to circulate around Beirut. "يا ريتني حصان عند بيت سرسو تيطعموني فستق وبندق." I wish I were a horse at the Sirsots to be fed hazelnuts and pistachios. Perhaps this was indeed what they put into the sarcophagus trough in order to feed their horses. Zakaria Wannous, a servant at the Sirsot household, in his oral history as told to his granddaughter Suad, recalls one of the parties the Sirsots threw for Jamal Basha. Inside the house, all was brightest luxury. The women's jewels sparkled by the light of the torches that lined the pathways of the garden. I stood outside the side entrance, waiting for the sound of the small bell that was my summons. I could hear the tinkling of piano music, and soon I became aware that the same song was being played over and over again. It lasted some 10 minutes, and then a lull could be heard, and then once again it would begin. Later, one of the maids told me that the usual musician had suddenly fallen ill, and the only one who could be summoned in his place knew but one song. It had become a joke that delighted the guests, who called for him to play it again and again in mockery and jest. As I stood outside, listening to the streams, I began to feel a sense of terrible foreboding. The repeated song was like an ill omen, an inescapable fate, time repeating itself eternally. I felt that the walls of the house would not hold, that the misery outside crept ever closer, like an animal prowling in the woods, and I was the only one who could sense its presence. It is said that Michel Sirsot, like many of the wealthy, hoarded stores of grain in his own house for his own use. It is also said that he had a valet, whose name has been lost to time, who had some sort of metabolic disorder that kept him cadaverously thin. He must have looked like someone famished and starving long before the famine even began. Michel Sirsot was so afraid of his grain stores being broken into that he had a special room built for them, with a doorway so narrow only his valet could squeeze in and out of the room. When Sirsot grew ill with typhus, the news spread throughout the city, and the poor and starving came to clamor at the gates of his house, chanting that God had stricken him with illness to punish him for his crimes. His wife admonished him that he should not go to meet his Maker with his sins on his soul, and so the cadaverous valet was sent into the secret grain room to hand out alms to the poor outside the gates. When Sirsot's health returned, he took this as a sign that God had forgiven him, and the poor were shooed off to return from wherever they had come. Is this story true or not? Is it really about Michel Sirsot the man, or is it a metaphor for Michel Sirsot the monster? In times of crisis, in times of great disaster, the distance between the ordinary and extraordinary collapses. In a sense, reality enters the realm of fiction, and the things that haunt the edges of civilization the monsters, ghosts, the things that are taboo, lurch across what used to be the border between the real and the unreal and take up residence in ordinary lives. At the height of the famine in 1917, the extraordinary sight of people dying in doorways, on church steps, in alleyways had become commonplace. Some of them, writes Charles Korm, the Lebanese writer, industrialist, and philanthropist, perhaps as a result of some strangely persistent peristalsis that has survived the organic breakdown of their bodies, have already, before even having given up their souls, have expectorated their intestines that drag behind them as they walk in the dust and garbage. Imagine, if you will, that image again, a march of the dead, their entrails draggling in the filth behind them. The cries of the hungry became so pervasive throughout the city that people could no longer sleep. On summer nights, one could either lie awake all night, listening to the moans of the dying, or shut the windows and bake inside with the heat. The Turkish writer Khalide Edib wrote of how she had to flee Beirut for the mountains in order to escape the cries of the hungry. Along with famine comes disease. As people grow hungrier and more malnourished, their immune systems grow weaker. That, coupled with the unsanitary conditions of the war, helped the spread of infectious diseases such as typhus and cholera. The hospitals grew so clogged with the dead that one nurse said they would be better off called cemeteries. The historian Ula Ziede describes making the rounds of the hospitals in the city with his family in search of his father. One hospital official directed them to, quote, a set of corpses lying on the pavement, awaiting identification. The corpses were preserved only by occasional rushes of cold water spilling over the bodies. One old man, sifting through the same corpses looking for his son, compared the grotesque scene to Kusa sitting in salt water, waiting to be stuffed. Hunger is a form not only of physical torture, but of psychological torture. It exhausts the body as well as the mind. It is said that the hungry can think of nothing else, sometimes talk of nothing else but food, that they even dream of food when they drift off to sleep. Imagine, then, the hunger of an old man searching for the body of his dead son and seeing food in the corpses. When reality becomes more akin to fiction, things both become metaphors and themselves. Otherwise, how to explain the locust plague of 1915? The locusts had come before, of course, but in 1915, they came in hordes that defied all memory and expectation. As though the entire area itself were an afflicted body, its immune systems shut down. The disease that last year might have spared it ravaged it now with ferocity. On March 22, 1915, the news spread that a cloud of locusts were spotted in the skies above Jaffa. The winter had been harsh that year, and the rain had flooded the streets, only letting up at the end of February to give way to strong eastern winds at the beginning of March, which hastened the advent of the locusts. A few days later, they arrived in Beirut and Mount Lebanon. Jean Touma's diary, April 15, 1915. Quote, for a week now the sun has not risen. A great cloud obscures the entire sky, and a great hum of beating wings and chewing mouths is the only sound we hear. It is as if the locusts have kidnapped the earth, or as if they have transported us to a hell in which they are the only masters. Who could have known that the devil could be so small? Unquote. It is said that no one had ever seen so many locusts. No sheikhs, no grandfathers could recall ever having seen such an amount. Like armies, like soldiers blotting out the sun. Not a single green leaf or flower or bit of grass was left, from meadows and fields to the smallest patch of weed in the cities, says Father Antonia Min. The locusts even filled the water tanks, pools, and wells of the Bayi, which was the water supply that serviced Beirut, and the supply was so clogged with locusts, the officials had to shut off the water to clean the pools. This left Beirut without water for 2 whole days, and they had already been without bread for 3 days. In the Baqa, the locusts were said to be so thick that when they covered the ground, they formed a layer knee-deep. So now, in addition to the naval blockade and the inland blockade, the locusts had arrived to wreak havoc and destroy whatever crops the farmers had managed to locally produce. A story so biblical in nature, it would be hard to believe. Nature and man conspiring together to wage war upon the people. Hunger itself is a sort of war upon the body, weakening its defenses, forcing it to barricade itself, turn inward, use its every last resource as it hunkers down, awaiting some form of rescue or else the oblivion of death. But hunger, too, is a tool of war and has been used as such since the beginning of warfare. Retreating armies burn fields and crops and butcher livestock in their wake. The entire point of siege warfare is to starve a population out, to weaken them so much that they become delirious, willing to do anything, sell themselves to anyone to save themselves. The British had designed the naval blockade, in fact, not only to starve out the enemy army, but to turn the hearts and minds of the Levantine population against the Ottomans. It was hoped that the deprivations of the war would help foment revolt against the Ottomans, and the people would look to the British and the French for salvation. The Ottomans, for their part, could no longer do anything to turn the tide of the Great Famine, which had taken on a force and momentum of its own. Their own army was starving to death and succumbing to disease, and while some members of the government wrote letters, tried to intervene on behalf of the dying population, some even resigning in outraged protest, there was nothing anyone could really do. But some of those fortunate enough or wealthy enough to be watching from the sidelines were desperate to help. They tried to get the word out about the extent of people's suffering, tried to muster aid and intervention by relaying stories of what people had been reduced to. Images recur in these stories again and again. People trailing behind livestock, waiting for the horse, the donkey, the cow to defecate in hopes that they might be able to pick out undigested grain from the feces. People following lines of ants trying to steal crumbs off their backs. People poisoned from eating lemon and orange peels. Many, many stories of people dying from eating orange or lemon peels. It is said that there is a pasture somewhere in North Lebanon called al-Bridani, as its owner sold the entire land for the price of a single orange to feed his son. Families committed suicide en masse. Men hung themselves rather than watch their families starve. Women sold everything they had for some food and then sold themselves. The government established courts charged with protecting public morality. Women were hauled in before the courts and publicly humiliated. Accusations led to ruin. These accusations were shameful because they were not simply about lack of honor, but of being brought so low by circumstance that people were willing to give up their honor. In response, stories also circulated about women who were so virtuous they were willing to starve to death so as not to besmirch their honor. Much of the middle class disappeared. They either clawed their way to the upper classes through opportunistic and illegal means, or slipped through the cracks and fell into abject poverty. Another story has been told and retold, cropping up more than once in different memoirs and recollections. The story goes as such. Jamal Basha, hearing of the famine, arrives to survey the situation for himself, to assess whether the population is indeed starving the way he has been told, or whether these are mere exaggerations. In one account, he arrives in Beirut, in another, to the village of Shwer. A local man fluent in Turkish bravely speaks for his people, professing their loyalty but telling him of their hunger, pleading for help. Jamal Basha asks, "Is there any among you who has eaten her own child?" The man shakes his head, disbelieving. He isn't sure he's heard right. "Is there any among you who has eaten her own child?" he repeats. The man is certain this time. No one has done such a thing. "Well," says Jamal Basha, You are better off here than in other places where they have done so, and you had better keep quiet. Is that what gave rise to the stories of cannibalism? The hope that people might be believed as to the extent of their starvation? Or were the stories true? One story that spread throughout the country was about 4 women from a village near Batroun. They traveled to Tripoli and managed to capture 4 children, 1 child for each woman. They lured them in with maternal voices and gestures and then slaughtered them. Perhaps with knives, or perhaps they snapped their necks, whose bones had become brittle with deprivation. The women made a bonfire and roasted the children over the flames, eating the flesh down to the bare bones. Then they threw the bones down into a well. Residents who drank the water in the well claimed to be suddenly able to hear the cries of the children as they died. A commissioner in the Tripoli police force investigated the incident, tracked down the women, and arrested them. Within a week, they died in prison. Were they beaten to death for their abhorrent crime? Did they hang themselves as punishment for what they had done? Or did they simply starve to death, having not eaten for weeks and weeks? There were many stories of women, always women, who had eaten children, always children, in order to be able to survive. One woman reported that, lured by the wonderful and unexpected smell of cooking, she had walked in on her neighbor and found her cooking her own child in a pot. When she confronted the neighbor, outraged, the woman replied, "My child died of hunger, so I am eating him so that I don't die in turn." But the first woman swore that what was in the stew pot had far too much meat on the bones to be the body of a child who had died of hunger. The child had been murdered, and the mother was the worst aberration of all. The unsexed monster, the woman who went against her nature as nurturer, provider, giver of life, a symbol of the destruction of the entire social structure, the loss of all mores and laws. Woman as both scapegoat and bearer of social ills. The accused mother was arrested and also died in jail. To die of hunger is to die one of the slowest and most excruciating deaths possible. The body begins to consume itself from the inside, desperate for energy, first depleting sugar stores, then depleting fat stores, then eating away at its own organs. Everything slows down, all the metabolic processes, in a desperate bid to conserve energy. People become listless, their eyes glaze over, a thin film of hair grows all over the body as it tries to trap heat and insulate itself. As the limbs grow more emaciated, as the ribs jut out almost as though they were trying to escape the dying body, the extremities swell up into monstrous appendages due to slowed circulation. Hallucinations set in. The death mask, the skull's head, appears long before the body finds its way into the grave. It is death in agonizingly slow motion. Worst of all, it is a death cruelly orchestrated as such. Famine is always man-made, never natural. It is unfathomable to even imagine what it must be like to die that way, let alone watch your family die that way, and you helpless to stop it. Some of those who watched tried to do something. They tried to get the word out, lamenting all the while that this was not enough. It is true, it was not enough. Khalil Gibran, who collected donations from the expat community in the United States, wrote a poem called "Dead Are My People," in which he asks, what can an exiled son do for his starving people, and of what value unto them is the lamentation of an absent poet? Of the first-person accounts I've read you above, some are true, some have been imagined, constructed and embellished from that which is true. Some anecdotes are rumor and conjecture, some are documented fact. When suffering is so great, it can hardly be believed. When the sufferers are competing for the world's attention, sometimes fiction is the only way to get the heart of the truth across. Did people really pick whole grains out of feces? Did they really eat their children? Did they in fact walk around with their intestines falling out of their emaciated bodies? Does this matter? It is not so much that the line between fact and fiction ought to be completely blurred, but that the fictions, exaggerations, and anecdotes that people tell are part of the larger truth of history. The truth is people were brought so low, they suffered so greatly, that these are the sorts of stories they told in a desperate bid to get people to look. Look what is happening to us. In every tragedy, there is that despairing cry. Look at what is happening. Look where we have come to. Sometimes, when we get lost in debating facts and veracity, we miss the larger point that the fiction or half-fiction is trying to tell us. Monsters walk among us. We were brought so low that we turned into monsters ourselves. After the war, the census went around making lists of the dead and living. In one village, one page of the ledger of the dead reads, Jabbour Khairallah and his wife, Dumet Jabbour and his family, Abdullah Abu Jresh, his wife and children, Mansour Hanna and his wife, Abu Hanna Tin and his wife, Barhoon Tin, Maroon Tin and his wife, the wife of Jirjis Assaf and his children, the wife of Dumet Assaf, Dumet Jirjis Na'mi and his young son, Sultan Salim, Khazin Salim and his children, Al-Khuri Boulos Mbat and his wife and children. In this one village, the census indicates that 186 perished and 168 remained alive. More than half the village. This was true of Mount Lebanon as a whole. Fully half the population had died of starvation by the time the war ended. The famine remains relevant not simply because it was a tragedy, but because the orchestration of that tragedy remains the blueprint for the region in which we live today, for the wars being fought in our region today. Fortunes, legacies, conquests, so many of today's grand palaces of power were built over and out of the bones of these dead. I will leave you here with my translation of the words of Father Antonia Min, a Jesuit priest who wrote a memoir called Lubnan fil Harb. The book was written as an attempt to get the word out about what was happening, what happened to the people Al-Ab Yamin saw dying around him. He was called an exaggerator, sometimes an outright fantasist, even though many of his stories have since been corroborated by other, somewhat less impassioned accounts. His style, it is true, is highly dramatic, fevered, ferociously angry. But the introduction to his slim book, from which I will be quoting here, makes the point that sometimes reality outstrips fiction, and when we can do nothing else as spectators to misery, that we must not turn away, that we must look and listen, and then afterwards remember and perhaps retell. Remember us, O living. This is the call that echoes across Lebanon's valleys, from the east to the west, from the north to the south. It is a shout come from the bellies of monsters, from the wings of owls and crows. Remember us, O living. We are your compatriots, and were once living just as you. We are the victims of injustice, the injustice of the slaughtering Turks. We are the victims of greed, the greed of the oppressive rich who hoarded our strength, the greed of the hard-hearted financiers whose money has made us extinct, who overturned our homes and arrested our souls. We are the victims of a disgraceful, unnatural hunger and deadly pestilence, and no one to bury our bones, and no one to dig our graves, and no one to dampen their dirt with their tears. And so say merely that we were here. Save us a memory. Shame on you not giving us a history to record the scandal and shame of our imbecilic killers, to blacken the pages of the oppressors' lives, those animals who call themselves sons of this sad country. Tell our brothers and sisters living abroad and in exile, tell them about those nights that no eyes had beheld before. Tell them about the outrage we lived, that awoke our forefathers' strangest and most terrible tales to gape in horror at the reality that had outstripped them. Thank you.
Could you tell us a little bit about your research process?
My research process? I just read a bunch of books and I interviewed some historians, and I visited the Sursut Palace and tried to get information directly from the source. And I saw the sarcophagus, actually, which is now a planter in the garden.
So he is a killer?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, I focus a lot on Michel Sursut, partly because one of the stories that he was the one who owned the wheat concession. So that is documented fact, and that is well known. It's well known that he speculated on the price, that he worked with other families to drive up the prices. In fact, even when people were begging for grain simply to as relief for the hungry, he refused to sell it at the normal price. So yes, for sure, he's a killer. But I focus on him more here, but there are in fact many other names, and a lot of the very prominent Beiruti families who are very well known were part of were part of what happened, and profited essentially off the deaths of people because people were so desperate.
Do you think there is any relation between this hunger time and the hunger time of Safar Barlik? Is it continuous or one stage, one period?
Yes, I mean, it was the same circumstances that were happening in the area. And as I mentioned here, there's also, I mean, the population was starving, but eventually also the Ottoman army themselves were starving, and the soldiers did not have enough to eat, and they were also dying. So they would walk into a village trying to get food, and some of them would beg for help, some of them would threaten the villagers, but the villagers had absolutely no food to be able to give them. And I think more soldiers died of hunger and disease than they did in the actual war.
What is the opinion of the judiciary existence of Michel Sursut?
Sorry?
What is the opinion of the judiciary system? What do they think of him?
Here?
Yes.
I mean, clearly he has been well rewarded.
Fine, but you have there's many writers about what he did. It's not only you. So what is it? Is it like he is a killer ignored through time?
I mean, there really hasn't been any redress of what happened. As Lebanese, we really enjoy the myth of the war of others upon our soil. It's always somebody else waging war here. And so essentially what happened is, after the Ottomans were defeated, and then the French mandate came in, and then eventually, Lebanon was granted its independence. What happened was, the local sons, quote unquote, were almost like above censure. They were the heroes of this new fledgling country, and nobody really wanted to talk about what had happened in the war or the people who had colluded, with the powers that be in order to commit these crimes. And so it was the Ottomans that were the bad guys, and it was just a much easier narrative for people to absorb.
Because, because I'm working on something that's called Truth and Reconciliation, and it's taking too much time here. And now I'm thinking that this guy, Michel Sursut, is something very obvious that is repeating itself. That there's always a minority that is plugging in the majority of the people, and nobody is saying anything. That's why.
I mean, it's essentially capitalism, so.
No, well, that's going too far, but it's okay.
In fact, it's more of a clarification because what's interesting is that, in fact, this story, though, like, we don't acknowledge that Michel Serso is a killer today,
Among many others, actually.
among many
yeah.
others, yeah. Let's not focus on him exactly, yeah. But in fact, it is a story that exists in the history book that's taught at the Lebanese schools. Not like the other stories that came after in years and that we have no mention. And as I remember well, there's this paragraph exactly that talks about the Batrak Hwayik, I don't know in English, بيرهن صليبه لبيت سرسو كرمال قمح وقتها.
Sorry, Masma, like.
وقتها I will say it in Arabic because
Yeah.
I don't know it in English. في مقطع بكتاب التاريخ يلي بتدرس بلبنان بيحكي عن رهن البطريرك الماروني بتخيل كان لحويك وقتها بيرهن صليبه يلي هو صليب البطريركية لعائلة سرسو كرمال مقابل عدد من يعني كرمال يقدر ياخد قمح ليتوزعوا على بعض القرى المارونية بالجبل كان بوقتها. فاي ثينك انه حتى هذا الشيء موجود بقلب كتاب التاريخ يلي بيتجاهل كثير قصص بس ان فاكت هول القصص شوي موجودين فما بعرف اذا هذا الشيء قطع معك بالريسيرش او.
Yes, هلا what was أكيد يعني مش not this story in specific اللي عم تحكي عنها بس إنه أكيد قطع مع يعني في كتير عالم who name ميشيل سيرسو by name و other families as well بس رحت مثلا جربت أحكي مع العائلة which is unsurprising. I was told إنه we don't know where this rumor came from. That he's a scapegoat, that this is not true, that this is a rumor, etc. So يعني there's enough doubt إذا بدك at least in the at least in the circles that the families travel in and that nobody wants to look at. And because you have this very powerful class and the guilt is shared amongst them, it's in everybody's interest not to talk about it. So maybe you have it in the history book, but it's of no consequence. There's not been any redress or, and all of these people who made their fortunes off of these miseries have continued to be able to keep their fortunes.
Thank you for this great lecture. I have one comment and one question. I think it's Elizabeth Thompson in her book who writes about the role of women in that period. And what's interesting is under these dramatic circumstances, she proposes a reading of an empowerment of women during that period because they had to take up a role that they never had before because their husbands or fathers were at war. And I find that an extremely interesting reading of that period regarding women. And I think that privilege, that position of empowerment didn't last so long, but it's worth noting. Mm-hmm. And the second, the question would be, in your research, what is the link between, I think there is a link between this Great Famine and then the huge exile of population and the diaspora that have left in other countries.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There were several waves of migration, but there was a huge wave of migration that took place during the First World War. And again, I wanted to focus a little bit more on the food and famine aspect, but there were so many things that happened around that, obviously, because it was a wartime situation. So, there was a black market that came up. There were all of these illegal money lenders. There was a lot of prostitution. There was human trafficking, all of these things. But there was a huge wave of migration. And in fact, something that I found kind of interesting is that a lot of women in Mount Lebanon, especially Christian women in Mount Lebanon, there were no more men for them to marry. And so a lot of them were sent abroad where they had family units in Brazil and in Australia and places like that, so that they could find husbands and start families, because there were just simply no more men. They had either gone off, been conscripted to fight, or they were dying, or they, so essentially that's what happened. And it was interesting actually, because I did this research initially in 2015. So it was at the same time that the garbage crisis was happening and there were protests in the street. And I think what I was most shocked by was sort of how little had changed of these sorts of structures. Whether it was the corruption of general officials, making things very difficult, not allowing people to speak, punishing them for protesting. Even these things that we joke about, that women have to travel in order to find husbands, and all of these things. And at the time, of course, everybody was joking about cholera and the spread of typhus and things like that. So it was very strange to read it, pretty much 100 years after it had transpired, and to see so many of these familiar elements, and of course, people dying of hunger in our own streets as well.
I think we can do one more question.
Just I wish to mention that there is about 20 to 25 years between the time of Sursuk and time of Patriarch Lehwayik. So there is a long gap. And what is mentioned in the history, he was, I'm not sure, but maybe his younger brother or his son, the man who was dominate and control the grain from Huran. And also, I think this hunger time and starving extended to Syria, extended to Halab, Homs, Hama, and Latakia.
Yes, it was greater.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
greater Syria, and in fact, also went down to Jerusalem and to Palestine, and because they were blockading the entire Levant essentially, and a lot of the region got their grain from Hauran. So these blocks applied to a lot of people in a very large region, and in fact, it's called the famine of Greater Syria and Mount Lebanon. But just per capita, the amount of people who died, the highest concentration was in Mount Lebanon, because they didn't have any other food sources.
Thank you, Lina. Shukran.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.